Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and this is going to be the 10th part in the series on double action, single action autoloaders. Today we're talking about caliber selection, which of course is going to be one of the most controversial videos in the series, I'm quite sure. Which handgun caliber is best? Before I get into the nuts and bolts of that and everything that's on the screen right now, I wanted to go ahead and share a few resources with you guys from which I got some of the information that I think you guys will find fairly useful and interesting. The first resource I wanted to share with you guys is ballistics101.com. They have ballistics information for most of the major manufacturers and most of the major calibers that are out there. Now, of course, this lists the manufacturer's numbers. These are not tests that these people did themselves. These are just the numbers that are basically pulled off of the box of ammo. And frankly, most manufacturers tend to be rather optimistic, shall we say, to use Paul Harrell's kind terminology for what they do with their numbers. Their test guns are usually considerably bigger in terms of barrel length than what would be considered typical for self-defense situations, and so their numbers in terms of velocity and also muzzle energy tend to be higher than what you're actually going to experience, but they still give you a rough idea of how powerful a particular round is, what the velocity is going to be, at least in rough terms. Like I said, they kind of tend to be on the more optimistic side, but they will give you an idea. And they have quite a few handgun rounds that are listed. You can see on the screen there, starting with 25 ACP, going all the way up to 500 Magnum. All right, another great resource to know about is Lucky Gunner Ammo Labs. This is a fantastic resource because Lucky Gunner, which is actually a ammo retail location online, they normally sell ammo online. They have this thing that is called the Lucky Gunner Labs, which they've actually gone through and done ballistic testings on a lot of the rounds that they sell. They basically got curious and said, we want to know how these things actually perform, and so they did a series of tests to measure how they performed. And they've got lots of different kinds of rounds that are in their repertoire, if you will. They have, let's see if I can highlight this here, 380, 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45, 38 Special, 357, 10mm, and 357 SIG. That's quite a range of ammunition out there that they've done tests on, and I would highly suggest that folks avail themselves of that. And the way that they've got it arranged on the screen is actually pretty good. It's somewhat data intensive, and so if you're looking at it on your phone on data, it might not be the best thing to look at. You can kind of slow the computer system down quite a bit, but it's really a cool layout. This is the 380 results, by the way. So the 380 Auto, 380 ACP ballistics test results. On the left-hand side, they'll talk about the particular kind of ammunition that was at play. Then they'll show you how the bullets did in the gelatin, how many inches of penetration you got, and so you can see a graphic representation of how far each bullet did. They did tests of 5 for each type of bullet that they tested. They'll give you an average penetration. They'll actually also give you a picture of what all the rounds looked like when they were done, also compared to an unfired bullet. Over here on the top you can see the fired ones. Some of them, in this particular case with the Barnes 80 grain, a couple of them expanded, the others basically not so much. But they'll give you a picture of what it looked like when it ended. They'll also tell you what the 5-shot average diameter was and the velocity. And what's nice about these tests, unlike a lot of the ones that the manufacturers do themselves, these tests are done with guns that are much more representative of what concealed carriers are going to be using. That is, the barrels are usually shorter, the guns are usually smaller. It gives you a much better idea of what real people are actually going to be seeing with these kinds of results. And by the way, just so that you know, oops, didn't mean to highlight that. Just so that you know, this little green zone that's in the middle of all of the results. That's considered the ideal range according to the FBI standard protocol for handgun rounds, 12 to 18 inches of penetration. As you can see, this first one here, the Barnes 80 grain TAC XB, most of them are below that. The Corbon 70 grain Powerball is pretty consistently right in there where it needs to be. But the Corbin 90 grain jacketed hollow point, it goes a little bit too far, would have a tendency to over penetrate according to the FBI standards. And Lucky Gunner puts this out there for free. As long as you can access the web, you can access this information, and they have all kinds of different rounds that they've tested. It is a really fantastic resource for comparing potential carry rounds. And like I said, they don't have just .380, they have a number of other calibers as well. They have, here's the 9mm results. Oops, went too far. The 40 Smith & Wesson results, so on and so forth. Absolutely awesome resource. And I used a lot of this in the material that I'm going to be presenting to you guys, and there's also some YouTube videos that Lucky Gunner puts out, and I used some of the results that they have from there because they didn't test all of the handgun rounds thoroughly, but they did a few tests in those videos, and I used that information. And another person who has done some testing that is worthwhile mentioning is Brass Fetcher Ballistic Testing. In particular, I'm looking at the page entitled 22LR Handgun Terminal Ballistics, and he tested out of a handgun with a 3.5-inch barrel, which might be a little longer than some people would use for a 22LR handgun, or maybe shorter than some. But out of a 3.5-inch barrel, he did some testing on some different kinds of rounds, and he gives his assessments as to how they did, and all of them wound up being yellow. In his schema, that's marginal. They were all below FBI spec, and so not all that great. But that is a resource that is out there as well, and he gives, granted it's not a whole lot of different kinds of 22 ammo that's out there, but gives you at least an idea of how the different kinds are going to do. So that is indeed useful. Another resource, and I'm going to be pulling from fairly extensively, is the Greg Elefritz study. This is found on the Buckeye Firearms Association, entitled An Alternate Look at Handgun Stopping Power, and it is an article by Greg Elefritz written back in 2011 in which he goes over his own study on stopping power in terms of real-world results. He explains a lot of it. He gives his data, a couple of nice fancy graphs, his overall conclusions, etc., etc. Good source to be looking at. I'm going to be breaking it down a lot of it in this video, but a good source to look at. Another thing that you want to look at is a summary as to why the FBI chose to go out back to the round that they originally hated. Recently, the FBI decided to go back to 9mm. For a long time there, they were using 40 Smith & Wesson, and they decided to go back to 9mm. And there's lots of places online that will give a summary of the FBI's finding, because the FBI did a study, and what came out of the study was 9mm is actually okay. And a summary of it is a very helpful thing to do. This particular summary is found on SOFREP, SOFREP, and it is entitled The Reasons Why FBI Went Back to 9mm. And they give a lot of good summary information there that everybody should know. One of them that will come up in our discussion is this very interesting fact right here. The LEOs, that is law enforcement officers, miss between 70 and 80% of the shots fired during a shooting incident, meaning that 70 to 80% of their shots are not actually connecting with the suspect that they are trying to apprehend, meaning that those shots are hitting walls, those shots are potentially hitting bystanders who would be situationally innocent. We saw relatively recently that be the case in the case of the UPS hostage situation, where a lot of rounds were fired in the direction of the UPS hostage takers, and innocent people wound up dying. One in particular, one bystander, and the hostage himself wound up dying. And that's because law enforcement officers using handguns tend to miss pretty often. But there's lots of other information in there that is useful as well, so I'd suggest that. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into talking about caliber. Now, given the resources that I had available to me and those kinds of things, I couldn't cover every single caliber that is out there, just because there are a lot of different calibers that are out there. But the ones that showed up in the Greg Elefrit study and had crossover in terms of the FBI results as to why they went to 9mm and things that you could find elsewhere, and information that you could get off of ballistics101.com, stuff that you can get from Lucky Gunner, either from their Lucky Gunner Labs website or from their YouTube videos, as well as the brass fetcher test results, those kinds of things. The calibers that I wound up with that I had a good amount of information for was 25 ACP, 22 LR, 32 ACP, 380 ACP, 38 Special, 9mm, 45 ACP, 40 Smith & Wesson, 357 Magnum, 44 Magnum, and then in the Greg Elefrit study, he also looked at uses of rifles, and he lumped all centerfire rifles together. We're mostly talking about this in context of double action, single action autoloaders, so of course rifles is kind of out there, but it is kind of interesting to think about in terms of comparison, and is information that was interesting and useful, and so I went ahead and left that in. He also did shotgun statistics as well, and he lumped all shotguns together, but 90% of the shotguns, at least 90% of the shotgun cases were 12 gauge, so most of the data is representative of 12 gauge. And then I also did some comparisons between handguns and long guns. If you look at all the handgun information together, you get this. If you look at all the long gun information together, you get this. So I did a little bit of that. All right, so those are the calibers that we're going to be considering, which is a huge chunk, so take a real deep breath, and let's go ahead and get into this. First thing that I want to talk about is the hunting standard. The hunting standard is a single pellet of buckshot. A lot of hunters know that if you want to take down a buck, a deer, and you're going to use buckshot, that at least one of the pellets, preferably more, but at least one of the double-aught buckshot pellets needs to hit the deer in the vitals, basically the lung and heart area. And if you can do that, there is a really good chance that the deer is going to go down in a relatively quick period of time, such that the hunter is going to be able to recover the deer and successfully hunt. If you have less than that, either a smaller projectile, you're going to need more of them, or of course if you miss the vitals, you risk hitting the deer in a non-vital spot, and the deer may very well eventually die. For example, if you don't hit in the vitals, you don't hit the lung and the heart, but instead you hit lower, like in the intestines somewhere, that can be fatal. It can prevent the animal from eating properly and those kinds of things. But sometimes that doesn't kill the animal until much later down the road, sometimes days, sometimes more than a week down the road. That's not really ideal for hunting, and carrying over into a self-defense situation, you don't want to defend yourself in a way that takes days or weeks to show up. And so the hunting standard of a single double buck pellet getting into the vitals corresponds roughly to a muzzle energy of 189 foot-pounds of energy and a diameter of at least 0.33 inches in terms of the projectile diameter. That is what is considered, at least by hunting standards, sufficient. Not necessarily optimal, not even close necessarily, depending on what exactly you're trying to do. But that is usually what is considered the bare minimum of what sufficient is. Another way to look at it is in terms of archery hunting. In terms of archery hunting, they'll usually use fairly fairly heavy broadhead arrows. Sometimes they'll weigh up to an ounce, but they're usually not firing them very fast, and they're still sufficient for taking down fairly large game like deer. They can also be used for hunting black bear and things like that. Not as reliably, but it can be done. And the muzzle energy that an arrow has is usually less than 100 foot-pounds. But it's a considerably bigger projectile. Like I said, the broadhead itself will, and the whole arrow as a package will usually weigh more than an ounce. So considerably heavy projectile going slower with less energy, but still real big. That's another way of looking at it. But in terms of fired projectiles, non-arrow type projectiles, actual firearm type projectiles, 189 foot-pounds and a diameter of at least 0.33 is considered the hunting minimum. So when we look at the calibers that are out there, one of the things that we want to consider is whether or not they meet the hunting minimum. 25 ACP for its kinetic energy, then 4 foot-pounds of energy that is there when it leaves the muzzle. The typical range that is given is somewhere between 64 and 66. Now for the muzzle energy information, I went to Ballistics 101 and I pulled most of the information from the Winchester information, and I did that just because Winchester is fairly typical range ammunition. It's usually not considered super high quality, but range ammunition, and they do have some defensive ammo as well. And so as long as I'm comparing the same brand across the board, you can get comparable results. There were other manufacturers, of course, but some of the manufacturers didn't make all of the kinds of calibers that we have there, and thus would kind of ruin the comparison. So to keep everything similar, I kept pretty much everything to just the Winchester numbers. So for the Winchester numbers, with 25 ACP, 64 to 66 foot-pounds of energy. According to our double-aught buck single pellet rule, that's a little low on energy. 22 LR, 66 foot-pounds of energy to 86 foot-pounds of energy, and that largely depends on the barrel length. 25 ACP normally has a very short barrel, and there's not a whole lot of variation, and so the variation in foot-pounds of energy isn't going to vary a whole lot. 22 LR, though, they have some defensive handguns that are made in 22 LR that have very short barrels, less than 2 inches, and some of them that are a little bit longer. Some of them that are 3.5 inches, 4 inches, like 4.25 inches, some as long as like 6 inches or even 9 inches. And so 22 LR tends to vary quite a bit more. And so that's why you're seeing a bigger spread there, 66 to 86 feet per second. Largely dependent on barrel length, but also the type of round that you're looking at as well. 32 ACP, 125 to 129 foot-pounds of energy. Still, though, below the buckshot minimum. Not quite up to that 189 yet. 380 ACP, on the other hand, just barely squeaks by into the proper category, with its minimum being around 189 up to 192 in the Winchester information. So not a huge spread there, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that 380 handguns typically are all pretty close to the same size. You don't usually find 380 handguns with 6-inch barrels or 5-inch barrels or even 4-inch barrels. Normally they're somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 inches. They don't usually get too far outside that range, and so the amount of muzzle energy you're going to get is not going to be too far outside that range. But they do at least meet the buckshot minimum of 189 foot-pounds of energy, and so that makes it at the very least viable. Maybe not optimal, but in terms of muzzle energy, it's at least viable. 38 Special, you're doing a little bit better, and at least in terms of your average kinetic energy. It can be as low as 167, which is below the minimum recommended of 189. But with plus P ammunition, you can get up to 278, and that is definitely over that minimum of 189. 9mm, you're doing even better. 9mm is usually somewhere in the low 300s to high 300s in terms of muzzle energy. There are some cases with like plus P ammunition or plus B plus ammunition fired out of longer barrels where you can get more than that, but out of self-defense type handguns that are, especially for concealed carry, that tend to be a little bit smaller, usually not going to see over 400. It's usually going to be in the 300 somewhere. 45 ACP can be a very powerful handgun round, up to 534, but the fact is that in the modern age, 45 is oftentimes cut down from what it used to be. When 45 ACP came out at first, it was basically the handgun components of the rifles, kind of how it was originally conceived of. It was originally designed for military use, and it was designed at a time when the military dogma and philosophy was that bigger is always better. This was at the same time that our main infantry rifle was a 30-06, a fairly powerful rifle round, and they wanted a fairly powerful handgun round to go along with it. And so I believe it was good old John Moses Browning that developed the 45 ACP, and it was developed along that same principle. Bigger is better. So he made a really big bullet. 45 is basically 4/500ths of an inch wide, which is pretty good size for a handgun round, or any bullet for that matter. And it was also a real good sized chunk of lead. Most of the time it'll range in terms of grain weight from 185 grains up to 230 grains. And to put that into perspective, there's about 237.5 grains in 1 ounce. So you're talking about basically a ½ ounce chunk of lead coming at you. That's pretty good size. And originally, it also would usually pack quite a bit of a wallop. It had a pretty big powder charge behind it. And so you could see fairly high numbers, like in this case, up to 534 foot-pounds of energy. But firing a 45 with that kind of muzzle energy is not overly pleasant, and lots of ammunition manufacturers have realized that people don't like shooting them at that level. And so a lot of times the powder charge in a lot of 45 ACPs is kind of cut down from what it used to be. And so in terms of practice and plinking ammo, mid 300s is a little bit more realistic for what you'll actually be doing. Defensive ammo, a lot of times they'll step it up a little bit. But unless you're dealing with a fairly hot load, say from Corbon or one of those kinds of manufacturers, or Underwood, a manufacturer that's known for having fairly hot loads, you're probably going to be somewhere in the mid 300s to upper 400s, depending on exactly where in the spectrum you lie, but very rarely do you get above 500 anymore. But it is possible. But what that does mean, though, is that 9mm and 45 ACP actually have a fair amount of overlap in terms of kinetic energy. They actually share kind of a range of kinetic energy. 40 Smith & Wesson, on the other hand, starts out in, at least in terms of manufacturer-provided data, starts out in the high 300s and goes into the low 500s. And so 40 Smith & Wesson is a lot of times, especially in terms of practice ammo and those kinds of things, actually a little bit spicier than, in terms of recoil, than the 45 ACP. The maximum potential isn't as high as with the 45 ACP. Like I said, if you're talking about a very hot load, like Corbon, Underwood, those kinds of things, 45 ACP is going to beat it. Then a lot of the common loadings, 40 Smith & Wesson actually has more kinetic energy than a lot of 45 ammo out there does, and especially in terms of practice ammo. In terms of practice ammo, 45 is oftentimes a little bit easier to shoot than 40 Smith & Wesson. And part of that has to do with 45 being a little underloaded in terms of practice ammunition, and it also has to do with the length of the bullet itself. 45 ACP is a fairly long bullet. whereas 40 Smith & Wesson is not very long. It was actually cut down from a 10 millimeter to be basically as long as a 9 millimeter. It's still wider, but in terms of the length of the cartridge, it's about the same as a 9 millimeter. And what that means is that when the gun fires, the slide on top is not going to go as far back as on the 45. So the energy that it has is delivered over a much shorter period than in a 45. And that tends to make 40 Smith & Wesson a very snappy cartridge to fire. In terms of shooter comfort, 45 is actually one of the most comfortable, depending on the combination of ammo and the gun that you have. If you have a gun with a fairly heavy slide, with a fairly long action, and you have one of the lighter practice loads, like say an S&B loading or something like that, though they tend to be fairly light, 45 can actually be very pleasant to shoot. And I have to admit this, I'm not usually a 45 guy, but there are 45 handguns that I've shot that with the right round in them, given that they have a longer action just because the bullet itself is physically longer, are actually easier for me to shoot than the 40 Smith & Wesson and even some of my 9mm handguns, as much as it pains me to admit that. But 45 is a longer round, and if it's loaded lightly enough, it can actually be a very smooth shooter. Alright, then going up from there, we have the .357 Magnum in terms of kinetic energy. According at least to the Winchester numbers, like I mentioned, these numbers are primarily taken from Winchester. 410 foot-pounds of energy on the low side, 583 on the high side. Now, like I said, there are some manufacturers that will kind of load over that. Corbon, Underwood, places like that, you can see more. But especially in terms of the more normal manufacturers, and especially as far as plinking ammo is concerned, 410 to 583 is a fairly normal range. And then after that we have 44 Magnum, and in terms of relatively common ammo, kinetic energy of 729 foot-pounds of kinetic energy up to 867. And of course that can vary with barrel length. Typically a longer barrel will give you more effective powder burn and will increase your muzzle energy because it increases the velocity up to a point. You can get to a point where you've added so much barrel that you're not actually getting any more out of the powder. All that you're doing is just adding resistance at that point, and actually can slow the bullet back down. But you usually don't see that out of self-defense handguns. But I am saying that 44 Magnum can be loaded hotter than this. This is just the Winchester numbers, keeping everything fair and copacetic. Now for the rifles as a whole, I didn't do anything with that because in the Greg Ellifrit study that we're going to be talking about, all of the rifles were all the centerfire rifle cartridges were all lumped together, and I mean I could do an average of different rifle calibers, but it wouldn't be overly meaningful. And the same thing with shotgun rounds. There's lots of different kinds of shotgun rounds that have very different muzzle energies. And while most of his study was done with 12 gauge, there were also other gauges that were at play as well, and so not as useful there. Alright, so in terms of muzzle energy, the 25 ACP, 22 LR, and 32 ACP is below the double-aught buck threshold. And because of that, in terms of muzzle energy, their kinetic energy, not really preferable. So what would be preferable? For most people, in terms of being accurate with the gun, they want something that is just powerful enough to get the job done, but literally just over line so that the recoil is still very manageable. And so you're going to want to look at the calibers that are still over that line but not super far over, and so those ones would be things like 380 ACP, 38 Special, and 9mm. They are all calibers that have the potential to have enough kinetic energy to get the job done, but they are not so powerful as to be prohibitive for people who are recoil sensitive. Now there are some people out there who have been shooting 45 ACP and 40 Smith & Wesson and 357 Magnum and even 44 Magnum for a good long time, and they've trained with them and they've trained under stressful conditions with them, and they can use them reasonably well. But it is a whole lot easier to get good follow-up shots with a lighter recoiling gun. And for defensive purposes, a smaller gun in that regard often serves you better. It doesn't require the bulk that a lot of the bigger guns require, although there are certainly very small 45s and fairly small 40s and even some small 357s. I haven't really seen anything that I would personally consider to be a real small 44 Magnum, but there are ones that are small enough to be considered a concealed carry gun, or at least that some people will use as a concealed carry gun. But the problem is that most of these bigger calibers, when you're firing under stress, and if you're someone who doesn't practice very often, you start missing a lot with these higher calibers, especially if they have really hot loads in them. Like I said, 45 can be an exception because a lot of the modern loadings are a lot less than they used to be, and that actually can be fairly manageable. But the others are usually still loaded fairly warm, and if you don't practice with them regularly, and especially practice under stress with them regularly, even something as simple as taking out a shot timer and hearing the beep and having to get so many shots in and a given number of seconds, things like that, just something to get the heart rate going, something where there's some kind of a time constraint. If you're not doing that on a fairly regular basis, the higher energy rounds can become prohibitive, and you'll start to flinch when you shoot, which usually means that you're not going to be very accurate with your shots. All right. And then the other part of the double-aught buck pellets consideration is the diameter of the projectile as well. In double-aught buck, a single pellet that is 0.33 inches is what is preferred. If you have a pellet that is smaller than that, and they do make buckshot billets that are smaller, but if you have a buckshot pellet that is smaller than that, you usually want more than one of those pellets to hit in the vital zone. If it's at least that big, 0.33 inches, one can get the job done. Not necessarily ideal, but one can get it done. If you have something smaller than that, you're usually going to want to have more than one. So, taking a look at the diameter of these different rounds, some of them come out pretty good, some of them don't. Now, one thing that is noteworthy here is that what a round is called and what the actual diameter is don't always match. For example, a 25 ACP bullet is actually 0.251 inches in diameter. It's actually just a little bit bigger than what it's called. And the same thing with 22. 22 LR often has a diameter of about 0.224. In fact, most nominally 22 caliber guns are actually 224 caliber guns, but we call them 22. 32 ACP is one that actually isn't 32 ACP, and it doesn't even round to 32. It's 0.3125. So that is different. 380 ACP is another one that is definitely off. It's called a 380, but the actual diameter of the projectile is 0.355. 38 Special, again, it's off. It's a 0.356 or sometimes a 0.357. And yes, you can actually have a little bit of variation in the width, and a lot of guns are such that they will run either width just fine. What happens as the bullet is pushed through the barrel, it actually gets compressed a little bit. And so the bullet is actually always a little bit wider than the barrel is. And if it happens to be off by 1/1000 of an inch, it's usually not that big of a deal. 9mm is also 0.355. 9mm and 380 ACP actually have the same diameter. They have different cases behind them, so they have different powder charges, and the bullets will be different sizes. A 9mm bullets at the end of the case is actually a little bit bigger than a 380, but in terms of diameter, they're basically the same. 45 ACP, its actual diameter is 0.451. 40 Smith & Wesson is one of the few handgun cartridges that actually is what it's called. It is a .400 diameter cartridge. It is really 40 Smith & Wesson. 357 Magnum is .356 or 7, just like the 38 Special is, and that was actually derived from the 38 Special. Basically what happened is that the 38 Special was found to come up short in some cases, and people wanted a more powerful round, and so they started making hotter and hotter 38 Special loads, And they found that it kind of created some problems, and so they lengthened the case just a little bit and created some fairly high pressure cartridges, and that is what became the 357 Magnum. And so they're just a little bit longer, and they have typically quite a bit more powder in them, so they pack quite a bit bigger punch than the 38 Special did originally. And the bonus of that is that 357 Magnum guns can actually fire 38 Special ammunition. The 38 Special ammunition has basically the exact same diameter, it's just the casing is a little bit shorter, and so the 38 Special rounds will fit in the 357 Magnum gun and they will fire. Now that doesn't work in reverse very well. I can't take a 38 Special gun and put 357 Magnum in it because the 357 Magnum rounds are a little too long. But if you have a 357 Magnum gun, it will fire the 38 Special. And then last but not least is 44 Magnum. And 44 Magnum actually kind of has a little bit of an interesting history. It's one that basically actually started in popular culture references to 44 Magnum revolvers. The problem though is that when they were started to be referenced in popular culture, they didn't actually exist yet. There were things like, what was it, the 41 Magnum and guns like that, but a 44 Magnum at the time didn't actually exist. And so people made a new bullet basically and called it what was already popular in the culture at the time. And so they made this new round. It was actually a diameter of .429, and they took the popular name that was out there of the 44 Magnum and put it on that bullet. All right, now in terms of our double-aught buck standard of .33 inches, which of these bullets actually meet that standard? Well, the 25 ACP doesn't, the 22 LR does not, the 32 ACP does not. But everything from the 380 ACP and up, in terms of diameter, do just fine. They actually do have sufficient diameter to be sufficient to the task of taking down a fairly large game animal, like a buck deer, which will usually weigh somewhere around 220-ish pounds, which is a fairly decent analog for an adult human male. Okay. Now another issue that comes up is how deep these rounds are going to go into the medium. And the FBI has been looking at handgun usage for quite a while now, and they rely on handguns to a great extent, so they've invested a lot of research into it, and they've come up with a protocol for penetration. And their protocol is that a handgun round needs to penetrate 12 to 18 inches in ballistics gelatin. And when it comes to that standard, they're not necessarily looking at expansion, because defensive rounds will sometimes expand. Let me go ahead and bring back up the Lucky Gunner ammo to show you what I'm talking about here. For example, here we go. Here's an example of an expanding bullet. You can see that once it's fired, it flattens out quite a bit, and that greater surface area tends to cause more damage. That's how expanding bullets work. But what the FBI has discovered multiple times over is that this expansion, while it does create an added effect, it's not nearly as important as how deep the bullet goes in the intended target. That is basically, as long as you have that at least 0.33 inch diameter, which is not hard to achieve because most handgun rounds just by themselves are that big. They don't need to expand on top of that to reach it. I'm not saying it's a bad idea to have expansion, but you're already wide enough to create a good blood loss trail. In terms of hunting, that's what you want, is you want blood loss. And a 0.33 inch hole will produce sufficient blood loss, as long as you can get deep enough to get to the vital organs. And in terms of ballistic gel testing, that comes to be somewhere between 12 and 18 inches in, we'll say, two-legged predators. We'll term it that way. So the next thing that I looked at from there is, according to the Lucky Gunner statistics and also the information from Brass Fetcher, is how many rounds that were tested actually met that penetration protocol. How many of them actually were able to penetrate 12 to 18 inches in ballistics gelatin. And this is regardless of the diameter of the round when it was done, just did it meet the depth or not. In those cases that were studied with 25 ACP, half of them were able to get to the correct depth. 22 LR, none of them were. They all came up just a little bit short. Well, there were some of them that were quite a bit short. But even the best ones were still just a little bit short of getting to that 12-inch mark. 32 ACP, basically 2 out of 3 were able to get the correct penetration depth. Now, as we said before, the diameter isn't quite there, but the penetration depth a lot of times actually is there. There are rounds out there that will do it. 380 ACP is one that's a little bit weird. About 30% of the ones that were investigated by Lucky Gunner were actually able to meet that penetration protocol. But that means that 70% didn't. And that's one of the complaints that people who use 380 ACP have, is that it does not tend to perform very consistently. There are some types of 380 ammunition that are very good, that will have the correct penetration depth and all that. Going back to the 380 statistics here, there are a few that will be in the green zone, like the Corbin 70 grain Powerball. It's in the right depth. But there's a lot of them that are either too low or too high, or too low. And so when using 380 ACP, 380 auto, your bullet selection is going to matter a lot. If you don't get the right kind, you're not going to wind up with optimal performance. It'll either underpenetrate or overpenetrate. And the danger of underpenetrating is, of course, that you don't get into the vitals like you want to, and aren't able to puncture anything that would actually create that blood trail that you're hoping for. You're not going to get any significant bleed out in terms of hunting, and of course that has its correspondence to self-defense applications. Or if it over-penetrates, what that means is that your bullet still had quite a bit of energy when it left the target, which can create problems for anyone who might be behind the target. But on top of that, it also means that a lot of the energy that was in that bullet is wasted, because it winds up coming out the back end instead of most of it being dropped in the target itself. So over-penetration, wasted energy. Under-penetration, you didn't have enough energy. And 380, a lot of times it's either under or over. Only about 30% of the time was it actually in between where it should be. Pretty much the exact opposite could be said with 38 Special, though. With 38 Special, 89% of the bullets that Lucky Gunner tested were actually able to stay in that Goldilocks zone. In terms of penetration depth, 38 Special actually does a really good job, and pretty much any 38 Special defensive load that you're going to find on the shelves is probably going to do a pretty decent job. It's not nearly as picky as 380 ACP. In terms of 9mm, only 44% of the ammos tested were in that green zone. 45 ACP, 49% were in the green zone. 40 Smith & Wesson, 53 were in the green zone. 357 Magnum, 55% were in the green zone. And 44 Magnum, 0% were in the green zone. And that is because 44 Magnum is an incredibly powerful round, and it has a tendency to over-penetrate. Lots of wasted energy with the 44 Magnum. And if you are recoil sensitive at all, operating a 44 Magnum under stress, trying to get follow-up shots, all those kinds of things, probably not going to work out all that well for you. So the ones that I've put in red are the ones that I would definitely be cautious about selecting in terms of that. Finding a type of bullet for that gun that's going to give you good penetration is going to be difficult. 22 LR, pretty much always underpenetrates. 44 Magnum pretty much always overpenetrates. 380 ACP, it usually does one or the other. It almost always underpenetrates, or it almost always overpenetrates. There's not a lot in the Goldilocks zone there. But just because a round has a good percentage in terms of how many of its bullets will perform well, doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot. The others are, in the 40s to 50s, or even into the 80s. But the main thing is there's ammo out there that is available that will have the correct penetration depth, and you can usually find it just fine. Finding it for the 380, 22 LR, and 44 Magnum, much more difficult. In case of 22 and 44, it's just about impossible. All right. So that is the basics, ballistics, as far as hunting is concerned. How much kinetic energy does it have? What's the minimum diameter that you need in order to produce a sufficient blood trail? And then how many of the rounds that are out there on the market are going to be able to do the job at hand? That's all from the hunting perspective. This is what we know from hunting. This is what we would expect when we come over into self-defense. What we're going to get into now, though, is the Greg Elefritz study. And let me go ahead and bring that up here. An alternate look at handgun stopping power by Greg Elefritz. We're going to look at the Greg Elefritz study, and his study is a real-world analysis of situations that actually happened. And when you look at what actually happens in the real world versus what they're ballistically capable of, there's usually a disparity. What happens in the real world is sometimes really weird. What you would think would be the most powerful or most capable round sometimes doesn't perform that very well, and things that you wouldn't think are all that powerful or capable sometimes wind up doing a lot better than you think they would, and that's because real-world situations are random and chaotic and, like I said, just weird. But the reason why we're going to look at the Greg Elefritz study is because in the real world, with real-world scenarios and real-world cases, that is where you need to be able to perform in terms of self-defense. He looked at 1,785 cases in which handguns were used to defend someone. And out of that 1,785 cases, we can look at how many, basically what percentage of those cases were devoted to each caliber. 3.81% of that more than 1,700 cases involve the 25 ACP. That's actually fairly large. A good chunk of them, 8.63%, involve the 22 LR. Now, this is where there's a myth that goes around that does need to be stopped right now. There's a lot of people who have said that more people have been killed by the 22 LR than all other cartridges combined. That is not true. Okay, the Greg Elefritz study, as well as a whole lot of other studies, point out that while there are a lot of people that will use 22s to defend themselves, they are not the biggest contributor to these kinds of incidents. Okay, gun-related deaths are not owed primarily to 22s. Okay, in the Greg Elefritz study, a little bit under 9%, okay, which is still a good size chunk, but it's not huge. Now, also in the Greg Elefritz study, 32 ACP did show up, but in a very small proportion of cases. Only 1.4% of the cases were 32 ACP cases. And that's actually the reason why that column is in purple. It's just because we don't have a whole lot of data on how 32 ACP actually performs in the real world. There's not enough data points for it to actually be statistically reliable. It's interesting to look at and all those kinds of things, but there's a good chance that the data that's been collected isn't overly representative of what you could expect in your particular case. It's just not a big enough data set to do that. But we're still going to look at it because what we got is what we got, and it's not used very often, but especially in the modern, but it did show up in his study. 4.76% of the cases that he looked at involved 380 ACP. Now, this study was done about a decade ago, and 380 ACP has definitely gained popularity since then. So if you looked at modern statistics, the proportion that goes to 380 might be a little bit higher, but still a decent chunk. 38 special, over 10%. The hands-down winner of the cartridge, the caliber that is most commonly used is the 9mm. A full quarter of the cases were 9mm cases. And then 45 also was more than 10%. 40 Smith & Wesson is over 10%, but not as much as 38 Special or 45 ACP. 357 Magnum is not super common, but fairly common, 5.88%. And I would suspect that the reason why it's not as common is just because 357 Magnum is a fairly powerful load. There's probably a lot of people that wouldn't feel overly comfortable carrying a gun with that kind of kick, especially in a stressful situation, being able to get follow-up shots, those kinds of things. There's not that many people that would feel confident and comfortable with a gun of that power. And then 44 Magnum, again, very small percentage of the cases that Greg Ellerfitz was able to collect, 1.34%. That's not really enough to be statistically reliable. We're still going to present the data and we're going to talk about it because it's available and it's what we got. But I wouldn't hang your hat necessarily on anything that is there in the 45 Magnum category. And like I said, Greg Ellerfitz also did look at rifles altogether, all centerfire rifles together. It was about 7% of the total. And he also looked at shotguns, and that was about 8% of the total. The rest of the data that we have going on from here is going to be derived primarily from that Greg Ellerfitz study. And the most significant piece of data that came, there's one thing I forgot to talk about in the percentage of cases. Some green and red labeling that I did. Red, of course, is something to watch out for. Green is something to look for. And that is that if we accept the premise that handguns work as self-defensive tools, it would stand to reason that whatever is working the most, whatever people gravitate towards the most, is in fact what is working the most. If we accept that it is working as it is now, whatever is most common is worth looking at as being a good thing. And so it would be a good thing to look at those most common calibers like 38 Special, 9mm, and 45 ACP. And if people are not gravitating towards certain calibers, it's probably for some fairly good reasons. So 25 ACP doesn't show up overly often, 32 ACP definitely does not show up very often, and 44 Magnum definitely does not show up very often. There's probably good reasons for why they're not showing up very much. I'm just putting that out there. Now, as far as statistics that were drawn that came out of the Greg Ellerfitz study, the most important one is the percentage of cases in which incapacitation occurred, which is a really fancy way of saying how often did using a gun of this caliber actually work for the defender? How, in what percentage of cases was the defender actually able to successfully use this caliber of gun to defend their life? That's what this percentage is. In the case of the 25 ACP, people who were using those guns were able to successfully defend themselves 65% of the time. Hey, it might not be a ton, but it is fair to say that this gives you at least fighting odds. Normally, you would expect that if it's one person to one person, your odds would be somewhere around 50-50. This is all the way up to 65%, so it still beats a sharp stick. Might not be great, but it's better than nothing. Same thing with 22 LR. 69% of cases, people who defended themselves with a 22 were actually able to successfully defend themselves with a 22. And might not be huge, but I don't know too many people that would volunteer to get shot by one either. Okay. It can work, and it gives you better odds than nothing. It might not be preferable, but it still beats nothing. 32 ACP, like I said, the data set here is very small, so this number is not as reliable. But as far as the data that Greg Ellerfitz was actually able to collect, 60% of the time it worked. That's still better than the 50-50 split you might expect without any kind of thing whatsoever. You know, it's still better than nothing, better than a sharp stick maybe, but not super great. But like I said, fairly small data set there, so you don't want to hang too much on that. 380 ACP, we see a massive jump in how well people are able to defend themselves with it. 84% of the time it worked out in the favor of the defender. 38 Special is right behind that at 83% of the time it worked out in the favor of the defender. And then when we get to what are nowadays considered common service calibers, like 9mm and up, we see a little bit of a jump going up to those ones. So from 84, 83, 9mm, successful 87% of the time. 45, just below that at 86% of the time. And one thing that's worth pointing out here is that this study is such that a difference in a couple of percentage points here and there is not really all that significant. So functionally speaking, 9mm, although technically it's 1 percentage higher, functionally it's not really going to be statistically different from 45. Okay, so just in case the 9mm people get overly happy, no, this is a study. The numbers are not going to be exact. There's a margin of error. A few percentage points within that margin of error, not all that big of a deal. So functionally, 9mm and 45 basically are just as good in terms of how successful people are using them. And then there is the 40 Smith & Wesson, and it also had a success rate of 87% of cases in which people were able to successfully defend themselves. We see a little bit of an uptick from there that is not insignificant from the 357 Magnum. And that is definitely interesting. It winds up being noticeably higher than a lot of the other service calibers. Oddly though, 44 Magnum, which is even more powerful than the 357 Magnum, we actually go down. Now granted, this is a small amount of data in the 44 Magnum category. It's not a very large percentage of the cases that Greg Elefitz looked at. But it does, at least based on the data that we have, look like there's a bit of a decrease there. And what is potentially happening is that the 44 Magnum is so powerful that people are not handling it very well in those stressful situations, and it winds up costing them accuracy. They wind up fumbling with the gun. They're not able to use it as well, etc., etc. Go ahead and minimize this so that we can see the whole study a little bit better. And then just to put this in comparison, let's look at rifles and shotguns, because Greg Elefitz studied those as well. People who used rifles, centerfire rifles, to defend themselves were successful 91% of the time. That's pretty good, but it's not actually any better than cases where people used a 357 Magnum handgun to defend themselves, which is interesting. It's good, but there are handguns that do just as well. And in the case of shotguns, the success rate was 88%. Now, shotguns are very powerful guns, but 88% is within what we see in the handguns. The more powerful handguns had success rates of 87% up to 91%. 88% is definitely in that range. In terms of success, how successful people are in defending themselves with these things, shotguns are actually not outside the norm for powerful handguns, which is interesting. And then if we look at them as total categories, and these are weighted averages, by the way, but the handgun average was 83.2%, meaning that if you defend yourself with a handgun, generic general handgun, you have an 83.2% chance of being able to successfully defend yourself. And if you use some kind of a long gun, either a rifle or a shotgun, a centerfire rifle or a shotgun, I need to specify, your chances do go up to 89.4%, but both of them are in the 80s. That is statistically significant difference, going from 83 to 89, but they're at least within the same ballpark of each other. And in terms of advantage, disadvantage, there are, like I said, three very distinct categories. There are very low performers, the 22 the 25 ACP, the 22 LR, and the 32 ACP. They work more often than not, but compared to all the other numbers, probably not often enough that you'd really want to bet your life on them. Then there are those that are pretty great. How did that number change? That should not be changed. Sorry about that, folks. My bad. That was supposed to be 83. Okay. So the 380 ACP and the 38 Special, significant step up from what a lot of people call the mouse gun calibers, the 25, 22, 32. Significant step up from those, but they're still not quite as much as what are called the service calibers, the 9mm and up. 9mm and up, there's not a whole lot of variation until you get to 357 Magnum. But basically anything that's on that side and the service caliber side is going to be more than adequate in most cases. And the 380 and 38s are not insignificant as well. But yeah, definitely probably want to stay away from the mouse gun calibers, and looking at a service caliber is probably a good way to go. All right. Now, another interesting statistic that we can glean from the Greg Ellerfit study in combination with the FBI study is how many shots it takes to reach incapacitation. Now, in the Greg Ellerfit study, he only looked at the total number of shots that actually hit the person's body. Not the total number of shots, but just the ones that hit the body. If we combine that with the data that comes from the FBI study that says that 70 to 80% of the shots are going to miss, we can get an idea of how many rounds you could expect at maximum. This is a high number, this is not a low number, but the number of rounds at maximum, this is a maximum average, but the maximum number of rounds that you would expect it to take to accomplish an incapacitation. Okay, so the number of rounds that you can expect to fire before the person that you're defending yourself goes down. And by the way, incapacitation does not necessarily mean that they're dead, it just means that they're not fighting anymore. Okay, there's lots of ways to be incapacitated that don't necessarily mean that you're dead. All right, in the case of the 25 ACP, the high side estimate average number of rounds that it would take is 10.5. I put that in red because I'm not aware of any 25 ACP guns that hold. This would basically be 11 rounds because you can't have 0.5 of a round. But basically, 11 round gun, I'm not aware of any 25 ACP guns that hold 11 rounds. In fact, a lot of them are significantly less than that. So that's definitely not good. 22 LR didn't have as high of an estimate. 7.6 was its estimate, and that's actually not too bad. There are a lot of 22 LR handguns out there that will hold, for example, 10 rounds. It's a fairly standard number for a 22 LR handgun. And that is at least marginally within the realm of what the gun can carry. And so if a 22 LR is going to work for you, and that's what this is assuming, in the cases where it works, how many rounds does it take? If the 22 LR does work for you, there's a real good chance that you're going to have a gun that has a high enough capacity for it to actually work out. So that's good news. In the case of the 32 ACP, the average was 19.9, and like I said, that's a high side average of more or less the maximum number of rounds that you would expect it to take, so basically 10 rounds. Problem again, though, is that I'm not aware of any 32 ACP handguns that actually hold 10 rounds. That's a pretty significant disadvantage if you don't have enough rounds to finish the job, which may have to do with why we see such a low percentage of success with the 32 ACP. It was only successful 60% of the time, and it probably has a lot to do with the fact that most 32 ACP handguns don't hold enough rounds. And like I said, the 25 ACP guns usually don't hold enough rounds either, and both of those wound up being less than the 22 LR. 22 LR handguns, a lot of them will hold enough rounds, and that's probably at least partially responsible for why the 22 LR is more successful than the other two mouse gun calibers. But getting past the mouse gun calibers, going up to 380 ACP, the high side estimate is 8. And there are actually a lot of 380 ACP handguns that will hold 8 rounds. You might have to top off with 1 in the chamber, but there are a lot of 380 ACP guns that will in fact hold 8 rounds. It might be 7 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, something like that. Sometimes all 8 will fit in the magazine just fine. But there actually are a decent number of 380 ACP handguns that will hold the required number of rounds, and so that's a good thing. 38 Special, on the other hand, is a little bit different story. The high side estimate is 8.6. Round that off to an actual usable number, 9 rounds. 38 Special handguns are usually revolvers, and most of the revolvers that are out there that are going to fire 38 Special are usually going to be 5-shot or 6-shot revolvers. There are some exceptions. I know of some some revolvers that will hold like 7 rounds and things like that. But for concealed carry, they're not overly common. And so this idea of the maximum number of rounds that would be used being 9 for a 38 Special puts you at a pretty significant disadvantage. There's a real good chance that you're not going to have enough rounds to finish the job, at least in what the gun holds by itself. You'd be looking at having to reload. And reloading a revolver can be done, not preferable though. 9mm, 10.5 rounds, rounded up to 11 to be useful. There are a lot of 9mm guns that can be useful concealed carry that will hold that many. And so for 9mm, that's not a huge thing. 9mm rounds don't actually take up that much more space than 380 does. It takes a little bit more rounds, but 9mm guns are usually a little bit bigger and therefore have a little bit bigger capacity. For example, one of my concealed carry 9mm handguns, my smallest one is my TPR-9C, my Bersa TPR-9C, and it has a standard magazine capacity of 13. So I'm a couple rounds more than what my maximum estimated need is, which means that the odds that I'm going to have to reload with that gun are pretty small. 45 ACP, on the other hand, isn't significantly different from the 9mm in terms of the number of rounds that it needs. 10.3, rounded up to something useful, 11 rounds. The problem, though, is that the 45 ACP is a fairly big bullet, and you usually can't fit a ton of those in a magazine very well, and especially in terms of something that would be easy for concealed carry. A lot of times for concealed carry, you'll see magazines that hold 6 rounds, 7 rounds, maybe 8 rounds, maybe if you top off the magazine, 9 rounds, but very rarely do you get to 10 or 11 rounds. Not very common at all. And so with a 45, there's a real good chance that you're not going to have enough rounds in the gun to finish the job. Now, one thing that people would bring up is that 45 is usually an autoloader, and autoloader magazines are usually much easier to change than, say, trying to unload and reload a revolver or something like that, and that's a fair point. But this is also a fair time to point out that most defensive gun uses are used in a span of less than 7 seconds. That is, from the time that you start defending yourself with your gun to the time that the altercation has ended is usually 7 seconds or less. And you've got 7 seconds or less to put, in the case of the 45, 11 rounds on target, which is very doable if you have that 11 rounds handy. The problem is that if you have to throw a magazine change in there, a magazine change is usually going to cost at least 1.5 to sometimes more than 3 seconds. And if that's the case, you might not have enough time to get the job done. Okay, just pointing that out. Not necessarily the case for every case, but, and like I said, this is a high side estimate, but it is possible that with the 45, especially if you only have a single magazine with you, that you can come up short. You're going to wish you had more rounds on you. 40 Smith & Wesson, very similar number, 10.3 again, but 40 Smith & Wesson is a little bit smaller round than the 45 ACP. And because of that, more can fit into a magazine. And when you talk about concealed carry handguns that would be common and usable for 40 Smith & Wesson, there's a decent number of them that will hold at least 10 or 11 rounds. For example, the Bersa TPR 40C, the 40 component to the one that I have, it holds 10 rounds. Now technically that's a little bit under what we would hope for, but it's close enough that it'll probably get the job done. 357 Magnum. It's the high side estimate for it for incapacitation. In the cases where someone was incapacitated, it would take up to 7.6 rounds. We'll round that up to 8 to be useful. I'm not aware of a whole lot of 357 revolvers, because that's what 357 usually is. It's usually a revolver that hold 8 rounds, but I do know of 357 revolvers that will in fact hold 7 rounds. So technically, is that exactly what it is? No, but within round difference, probably not going to be enough of a difference to make a difference. To be fair, though, a 357 Magnum revolver with a 7-shot cylinder, while they do exist, they do also tend to be fairly big, and because of that, not overly practical for concealed carry. But there are guns that are in the window of at least usable. Maybe not optimal, but at least usable. 44 Magnum is another disadvantage. It takes 8.6 rounds on the high side. 44 Magnum doesn't usually have that many rounds in a cylinder. A lot of times you're looking at 5 or 6, somewhere around that. Now, so to be fair, we don't have a whole lot of 44 Magnum data. It only represents 1.34% of all the cases that Greg Elfritz looked at, so this number might not be overly accurate. But given how powerful the gun is, the fact that people under stress tend to miss quite a bit, and if you add on to that a powerful gun that they're operating under stress, they're going to start getting really flinchy, they're going to pull a lot of their shots. This number of 8.6 might not be that far off. I wouldn't bet too much on it, but it's possible. Alright, so in addition to looking at how many rounds you might need to do the job according to the Greg Elfritz study, another thing that is a good thing to look at, and like I said, I'm combining for that one for looking at number of shots that it'll take. I was combining the Greg Elfritz data with the FBI data of how many misses you have, because Greg Elfritz only looked at the number of hits that were on the body. To get the total number of rounds shot, you need some kind of an estimate beyond that. I use the FBI number. So it's kind of a high estimate, but I think a fairly realistic one as well. And especially when you take into account that a lot of people who have defensive guns don't have the time to go out and train with them regularly. These numbers are considerably higher than what a lot of people will talk about. For example, someone that I follow on YouTube fairly often, Paul Harrell by name, will often say that a 5 or 6 shot revolver is sufficient to get the job done in most cases. And to a certain extent, I kind of agree with him, with one major exception. That is that he is looking at it from the perspective of someone who is competent with their firearm, who's trained relatively often, who's operating a firearm that is not outside of their operational range, such the recoil is going to bother them, etc., etc. And he himself is a fairly proficient marksman. And for someone like him, a 5-shot revolver in most cases is probably more than enough. But if you're talking about people who have, and you also have to understand that on top of that, he's a former Marine, he's dealt with stressful situations before, life-threatening situations before, he knows how to operate under those kinds of stresses, but the average person who would own a defensive handgun does not fit that bill. A lot of them are not expert marksmen. A lot of them struggle to hit the target at 7 yards. And you add the stress of, your life being in danger. On top of that, you might not hit the target at all. You're going to miss a lot of shots. And then you have to deal with the fact that these are people that are not used to stress at all. They don't practice very often, etc., etc. That possibility that's viable for him and people like him who are proficient marksmen, who are using guns that were within their operational capability, who've dealt with stressful situations in the past, they know exactly how they're going to react to it. The further you get away from those ideals, the less likely you are to be able to handle a situation with the 5 or 6 shots that you're going to find in a typical self-defense revolver. And so I think that these numbers here are a little bit more realistic. Now, I did forget to mention what happens with the long guns. The estimates for misses with long guns is not nearly as high as misses with handguns. A lot of times with long guns, if you're talking about self-defense distances, now if you're talking about military distances, military engagements, it's a little bit different story, but if you're talking about at civilian self-defense distances, usually no more than about half the shots are misses, which means that the average number of shots that it takes to take care of a threat is going to be considerably lower. For a rifle, 2.5 shots, round that up to 3. Shotgun, 2.3 shots, we'll round that up to 3. With a long gun, it takes considerably fewer shots because you're going to be much more accurate, especially at self-defense distances. Okay. And this is one of the reasons why I recommend to people, obviously you can't carry a long gun around with you all the time. It's not exactly convenient to go shopping for groceries with an AR strapped across your back. You're going to get a lot of unwanted attention, in addition to the fact that the thing is just going to get in the way. Much more convenient to carry a small gun inside the waistband or something like that. But for home defense, where you don't have a lot of those size constraints, a long gun is a really good idea just because of the increased accuracy. It's not going to take as long to get good hits on target with a long gun, whether it be a rifle or a shotgun. Okay. And then if we look at the average, the handgun average, and like I said, this is weighted for the different percentages of cases. The handgun average is 9.53 rounds, basically 10 rounds to successfully do the job, and the long gun average is 2.4, round that up to 3. So with a handgun, you can, at maximum, expect, in dealing with a single assailant, you can expect to take up to 10 rounds to deal with the situation. With a long gun, if you're dealing with a single assailant, probably 3 rounds at your max. Long guns are just more accurate at those kinds of distances under those kinds of stresses and strains. Under stress, people can usually aim a long gun a lot better than they can a handgun. And the differences in kinetic energy and muzzle energy and those kinds of things usually are not that big of an issue with the long guns as they are with the short guns as far as accuracy is concerned. Okay, so like I said, not really convenient to carry, but it's something that you would have staged in your home somewhere. Having a long gun around is not a bad idea. Okay, just from the accuracy standpoint, if nothing else. All right. And then also looking at the Greg Elfrit study, another thing that is worthwhile considering is the head and torso incapacitation rate. In the Greg Elfrit study, he looked at particularly at hits to the head or torso. That is basically the main part of the body that you're going to be aiming at, and basically ask the question, if you aim at the part of the body that you're supposed to, the head and torso, how likely is it that a single shot is going to cause incapacitation? He didn't quite frame it quite like that, but from the data that he provides, you can look at that. He provided information on how many incapacitations there were, and he also included information about how many shots were fired that actually hit the head or the torso. So if you actually hit the head or the torso, how likely is it that that single round is going to produce an incapacitation? And like I said before, incapacitation is not the same thing as killing the target. Incapacitation can have a lot of different reasons. It just means that the target isn't fighting against you anymore. For example, if you fire off a round and it doesn't hit someone, but the person that you're shooting at decides that they don't want to be in that area anymore where they're getting shot at, in a sense, that counts as an incapacitation. Now, in Greg Elfritz's study here, he's looking at shots that actually hit the head or torso. But it is possible to hit someone in a non-vital area. There's plenty of places, even in the head or the torso, that you could hit that are not vital. They won't immediately take you out of action. But just the fact that you got shot can be enough to dissuade a person from taking any further action. They decide, oh, I don't like being shot, I'm going to stop doing this. That's an incapacitation. There are wounds that you can have that, if left untreated, could be mortal wounds, but if they receive prompt medical treatments, they can survive them. And so the person might not die just because they're receiving medical care, but for the interim, they were still incapacitated. They were, still holding their hand on their chest to keep themselves from bleeding out and stuff like that. They might not be dead, but they're also not in any condition to fight. So an incapacitation is not necessarily death. It's just enough to keep them from fighting. So if you hit someone in the head or the torso with a given caliber, what is the functional likelihood in real-world cases that the person is going to stop attacking you? In the case of the 25 ACP, that's about half the time, 48%. If you actually do hit them in the head or the torso, about half the time, the person that you want to stop doing the bad thing is going to stop doing the bad thing. In the case of the 22 LR, it was considerably higher. If you actually hit them in the head or the torso, their likelihood of stopping was about 66%, which is interesting. In the case of the 32 ACP, again, only about half the time, 51%. Now, 32 ACP data set is fairly small, so take that with a grain of salt, but about half the time it worked. 380 ACP, fairly high success rate at getting people to stop what they're doing with a single shot to the head or torso. 63% of the time that worked. 38 Special is below that by a bit, about 58% of the time. Still more than half though, that's not terrible. And then an interesting thing happens when you get to the typical service calibers. The 9mm, the 45, and the 49 have incapacitation rates of in the high 40s. 48% or 49% for the 40 Smith & Wesson. And like I mentioned before, with the size of study that this was done, a percentage point here or two difference isn't really all that statistically different. So functionally, the 9mm, the 45, and the 40 Smith & Wesson incapacitate at the same rate. But you'll notice that it is considerably lower than a lot of the other rounds that we've already talked about. And even when we talk about rounds on the other side, like the 357 Magnum and 44 Magnum, those seem to be a lot more likely to create an incapacitation with a single shot to the head or torso. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of possibilities, but the biggest difference is probably how the guns are actually functionally being used. When we talk about guns like, say, the 22 LR, and a lot of these other, mouse gun calibers, 25 ACP, 32 ACP, even the 380 ACP, a lot of those smaller caliber guns, people are carrying literally just as backup weapons. They're get off of me guns. They're guns that people will pull if basically someone is on top of them and they don't have a way to run away. So these are guns that are much more likely to be used at very close ranges. And there's a good likelihood that the person that is attacking them was not aware at all that they had any kind of a gun on them. And so the shot will take them by surprise. And the more surprise, the more confusion, etc. that goes on, the more psychological impact that's going to have. If they don't see it coming, it's going to have a greater psychological impact on them. And then there's also cases where people know that they have a low power gun, and because of that, they are very, we'll say, judicious in where they aim. Just to give you a fun example of that, or a somewhat humorous way of presenting it, Paul Harrell liked to demonstrate proper target placement for small calibers this way. You can see he has the normal silhouette, but where he actually put the shoot and see target is at a very particular part of the target. And this is how he says that he recommends that people practice for the mouse gun calibers like the 22LR and things like that. So part of it is the fact that people who are being shot by these guns are oftentimes surprised that the people even had these guns, because they usually don't pull them until the last minute. And then on top of that, especially in cases like, say, the 22LR, the person who is defending themselves with it, knowing that they have an underpowered gun is probably going to pick a very specific part of the body to shoot at, which is going to result in a greater incapacitation rate, we'll say. Now, when we get to the common service calibers, though, those functionally are usually used as more standoff type weapons. Instead of the smaller guns that are get off of me guns, you've already gotten way too close and I realize that I need to get out of here. The service calibers are more so standoff weapons. You're over there and I want you to stay over there. They are guns that functionally typically are announced more because the people who are carrying them are usually more comfortable using them at distance. That is, 25 ACP is not known as being a great target round. Most people who are trying to go to the range and hold a group at 25 yards are not usually going to be doing that with a little 25 ACP. It's hard to hold a really good group with a 25 ACP at 25 yards. Or even a 22 LR can be somewhat challenging. And a 32 ACP, those guns are usually fairly small and not really good to do at distance. And the people who have those guns generally know that they're not good at distance and they wait until the last minute to pull them. But 9mm, 45, 40 Smith & Wesson, the people who use those guns will oftentimes practice with them at distance. They're more comfortable with them at distance, and so they're not as likely to pull them at last minute. They're much more likely to pull them earlier in the confrontation. And so the people that they're shooting are usually much more aware of the fact that they have a gun, and they're going to expect it. It's not going to have as big of a psychological effect. So the, oh no, I've been shot factor usually isn't as much there. Okay. In the case with the smaller guns that people aren't as likely to pull until later on, it surprises the person that they're shooting. Or they might be shooting at a part of the body that is probably going to be more effective, we'll say. But the service calibers, people are going to be comfortable using them earlier in the fight and at a greater distance. So the people that are being shot with them are going to know ahead of time that they're going to be shot with them. They can kind of psychologically steel themselves against the shot. And because of that, it's not as likely to produce an immediate incapacitation with a single shot to the head or torso. It's still pretty good, just under 50%, but it's not as high as we saw with the other ones. 357 Magnum is definitely an outlier, and a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that it is, one, a fairly powerful round, and two, 357 Magnum is usually, of course, fired out of a revolver, and a lot of self-defense revolvers are only going to be 5 or 6 shots, in certain cases 7-shot guns. And a lot of people, because of that, are going to be very judicious in how they use those rounds. So you have a powerful gun, and the people who are using them know that they don't have a lot of shots, and so they're going to be fairly specific about their aiming point and those kinds of things. They're not going to fire wildly. They know they only have so many shots to get the job done, and what that means is that in terms of incapacitation, they're more successful. 44 Magnum, it's more powerful than the 357 Magnum, but its incapacitation at a single shot to the head or torso rate is actually lower. Part of that might just be the fact that we don't have a lot of 44 Magnum data, and so the data isn't really reflecting what would really happen. That's a possibility. Or if the data actually is accurate, what this is telling us is that the 44 Magnum is just a rather unwieldy gun in those situations, and because of that, it cannot be used as effectively as the less powerful 357 Magnum. By comparison, rifles and shotguns have a head and torso incapacitation rate of 80% and 86% respectively. That is a considerable jump. Basically, if you hit someone in the head or a torso with a rifle or a shotgun, there is a really good chance that they're going to go down on that first round. If you hit them in the head or torso with a rifle or a shotgun, a lot of times that is a fight ender. And to look at the averages, the handgun average is 52.4% chance that the person is going to go down after taking one shot to the head or torso. With a long gun, the average is 83.2% average that they're going to go down after one shot to the head or torso. So This is where you can really see that the power and the effect of a long gun really is substantially greater than a handgun in that regard. And you might wonder what the difference is between the percentage of cases that incapacitation occurred and the head or torso incapacitation rate. It's basically this. In the head and torso incapacitation rate, that's basically on a per round basis shot to the head and torso. Okay. How likely is a single shot to the head and torso likely to incapacitate someone? But the overall incapacitation rate, which is what the one in bold up there is, that is, you get to fire as many shots at the assailant as you want to. And if you can fire as many shots as you want, how likely are you to deal with that threat? And if you get to fire multiple shots, greater chance that the threat is going to go down. The head and torso incapacitation rate is more or less a single shot incapacitation rate. Okay. You fire more shots, your likelihood of dealing with the situation successfully is going to be higher. It's just the way it works. All right, another important statistic to look at is the lethality rate. So if I shoot someone in the head or torso, that's what the H plus T means, head and torso shots. If I shoot someone in the head or torso, how likely is it that that round is going to kill them? In the case of the 25 ACP, from real world data, about 18% of people died from a single shot to the head or torso. 22LR was 32%. We'll come back to that one because that's a fairly high number. 32 ACP was 18%, which is again fairly high, but with 32 ACP we don't have a whole lot of data in the first place, so it might not be all that accurate. 380 ACP was 22%, again fairly high number. 38 Special, 20% chance that with a single shot to the head or torso that the assailant is going to die. Fairly high number, but not huge. 9mm is really interesting in this regard. Chances that they're going to die from a single shot to the head or torso is only 13% with the 9mm. And again, we see a pattern where the service calibers don't tend to be as effective on a single shot basis as the other guns are. And a lot of that has to do with the standoff distance. 9mm, only a 13% chance that a single shot to the head or torso is going to kill you. 45 ACP is more lethal, but not by a huge amount. It's 16%. And this does go back to the simple fact that the muzzle energy of a 45 is typically higher than that of a 9mm, and so we would expect its lethality to be higher. The incapacitation rates for the two are basically identical, and that is due to the simple fact that the incapacitation rate also includes a lot of psychological aspects. Lethality, though, is lethality, and bigger, more powerful bullet typically is going to be more lethal. The 40 Smith & Wesson kind of splits the difference between the two at 14% lethality for head and torso shots. 357 Magnum, again, picks it up a little bit to 25%. And 44 Magnum, again, drops down from the 357 all the way down to 17%. Now, what I wanted to come back to is the 32% of the 22 LR. This is really interesting. The 22 LR actually has the highest lethality rate out of all the calibers that we're looking at here. And the simple question is why? The other calibers are certainly more powerful in terms of kinetic energy. A lot of them have a bigger diameter, so you're going to get a better bleed out hole, etc., etc. What would make the 22 LR so, by comparison, deadly? And frankly, I think a lot of it has to do with the mentality of one group of gun users versus the other. People who use these small guns, or these guns that are kind of more so in the backup realm, they're not considered service caliber guns, so even including the 380 ACP, the 38 Special, and even a lot of people that would have a 357 Magnum will have a very similar mentality, and that this is a last-ditch kind of a thing. And so their standoff distances are going to be much closer, sometimes basically point blank, and As Paul Harrell is demonstrating for us here, their chosen targets is probably going to be a little bit different from someone who has a standoff range of, say, 7 or 10 yards. If it's point blank and you need to end the threat immediately, there's one spot on the target that's pretty much guaranteed to do that. And there's a good chance that at that close range that people are taking that shot. And I think that is probably what most contributes to 22 LR having such a high lethality rate. It's not that it's mechanically more powerful than the other guns, it's the range at which it's being used and the precision with which it's being used at that range. Okay. That is, they're actually able to, as Paul Harrell would say, hit the right part of the target when they want to. But this creates a weird contradiction. The 22 LR, in terms of its overall success, isn't all that high, only 69%. But it is the most lethal round that is out there. So how can you have something that isn't all that successful be so incredibly lethal? And again, I think it comes back to how it's used. When it comes to these small caliber guns, these non-service caliber guns, people are using them as backup. They're drawing them at the last possible minute, basically after the distance gap has been closed. And I think there's a good number of cases where the people simply aren't able to bring their gun to bear successfully. Okay, there is another study that was done, and Lucky Gunner talks about this in one of their YouTube videos, and I'll go ahead and reference it here, and that's where this information right here comes from. There was another study that was done as to why citizens lose gunfights. And there were 4 basic reasons that the study came up with. The first reason why citizens lose gunfights is because their gun that they bought for self-defense is inaccessible. It's in a different room, it's locked in a gun case, they left it in their car, etc., etc. The gun just simply isn't with them when they needed it to be. The second reason why they failed is that the gun isn't ready to fire. In the case of an autoloader, a lot of times what that means is that they didn't chamber a round. They didn't have the gun ready to go, or it had the safety on and they forgot to take the safety off, so the gun wasn't ready to be used. Third reason is insufficient accuracy. That is, they were able to get the gun out, they had access to it, and they were able to fire the gun, but they weren't able to do it with enough accuracy. In the case of the 22 LR, if you're looking at it as just a backup gun, a get off of me gun, not a stay away from me gun, but a get off of me gun, there is a good chance that even if you do get it out and you manage to get a shot off, that in the chaos of that moment, that you're not going to be as accurate as you would hope you would. Okay, so there are some shots with the 22 LR that at close range are going to be very accurate because you're right there, and if you have access to put the gun right there, you can end the fight right there. But if you can't get the gun right there, and you're operating at such a close range, you might not have time to get the next shot off, and that creates a huge problem. And then last but not least, a mechanical malfunction. And this is a problem that happens a lot of times with the smaller guns, more so than the big guns, is that they are more prone to mechanical failures than the larger guns are, and the larger caliber guns are. And so what we see is that sometimes, for one reason or another, it just simply doesn't work for the person. But in the case that they do work, they're putting the gun basically in the right place at a really close range, and that creates a high lethality. So basically with 22 LR, it's either you're going to take a very deadly shot, or you're not going to be able to get the gun out and on target quick enough with the mentality that most people have in using it to really be successful. And so it's a weird kind of contradiction that it's one of the least effective calibers overall in terms of did it successfully defend you against an attacker, but it is the most lethal one on the list. And like I said, I think it just has to do with how it's being used. People who have a .22 know that it's a .22. They know that it's not very powerful. And so there's a lot of them that, as Paul Harrell says, will put the round in the right part of the target. And that creates a very high lethality rate. But the question of whether or not they're going to have enough time and the opportunity to put the round on the right part of the target is not always going to be high with such small guns, because like I said, a lot of people carry them as just backup guns. They use them as get off of me guns, not keep away from me guns. The guns that have the lowest lethality are the typical service calibers, 9mm, 45, and 40 Smith & Wesson. These are not get off of me guns. They're usually stay away from me guns. People who carry them are much more comfortable operating at distance, so they tend to draw them much sooner in the fight. The people that they're interacting with, the people that they're trying to defend themselves from, will see them much earlier on and take steps to protect themselves. They'll duck behind cover, they'll run away, etc., etc. They're not as likely to try to get close to you, and that winds up being better for them. They don't die, at least not as often. In the case of the 9mm, they don't die very often at all. But in terms of success, did it keep the other guy from doing something to you? And in the terms of the 9mm, yes, it was a great success rate. 87% of the time it did its intended function in terms of keeping the other guy away, and only 13% of the time did you actually wind up having to kill him with a single shot. Now, of course, if there's multiple shots, the lethality rate goes up. This is basically on a per shot basis. But fairly high effect with relatively low cost to human life. And the 45 and the 40 are similar in that regard. But again, .357 Magnum. It's a revolver. A lot of people know that it doesn't hold a lot of rounds, tend to be much more judicious in their use of it, tend to treat it more as a get-off-of-me gun instead of a standoff gun, and that creates a higher lethality. So, .32 LR, in a sense, is actually the most lethal handgun round that is out there. But like I said, that probably has a lot more to do with how it's being used than with the power of the caliber itself. Alright, and then the real statistic that's worth looking at, you'll notice I didn't put any of those in red or green. And that's because individually, each one by itself isn't all that meaningful. But when you compare the two, when you do lethality versus incapacitation, then you get a very interesting study. And it's basically your chances. What are the odds of killing someone if you've capacitated them with a single shot to the head or torso? If I have to incapacitate someone with a single shot, what is the likelihood that I'm going to kill them with that single shot? And that is very interesting. With the 25 ACP, that's a 37.5% chance, basically, that if you've incapacitated someone with a head or torso shot where you're supposed to be aiming, that they're going to die. That's pretty high. 22R is even higher than that. If you have shot someone so as to incapacitate them in the head or torso, there's a 48.5% chance that they're going to die. 32 ACP is high, but not terribly high, 35.3%. Again, though, the 32 ACP data, there's not a whole lot of it. It was only 1.4% of the entire study. Probably not best to hang your hats on that, but the numbers are somewhat similar to what we're getting from the other mouse gun calibers, so it's probably not too far out there either. The 380 ACP and the 38 Special are also fairly similar, 34.9 and 34.5 respectively, in terms of how likely it is to be lethal if you've incapacitated someone with a head or torso shot. Basically, about a third of the time, if you've incapacitated someone, they're going to die. And again, that probably has to do with how people are using those guns. They're using them as get off of me guns. They're not using them as stay away from me guns. They're not using them as standoff guns. When we get to the ones that are used as standoff guns, there's a little bit more interesting variation. The 9mm And the 40 Smith & Wesson are both below the 30% threshold in terms of lethality versus incapacitation. 9mm, only a 27.1% chance that the person is going to die if they've been incapacitated. 40 Smith & Wesson, 28.6% chance that they're going to die if they've been incapacitated. But what is weird here is the 45. If you've incapacitated someone with a single shot to the head or torso with a 45, the chance that they're going to die is basically a third, 33.3%. It is a little bit higher than the 9mm and the 40 Smith & Wesson. And that is something that you would expect from a 45. A 45 is a big bullet, and even if you have a non-expanding round, it doesn't open up like a lot of the hollow points do. Let's say it fails to expand, you shot it out of a short barrel, it didn't get up to expansion threshold. And by the way, expansion threshold is the velocity at which those expanding bullets open up. And sometimes out of a real short barrel you don't get to that. And if that happens, and even if a 45 doesn't open up like it's supposed to, it's still a really big hole. A 45 diameter hole is going to allow for a lot of bleed out. And because of that, there is an increased chance that the person is going to die from it. It's just a big hole, and there's a lot more likelihood of bleed out from that, from either the 9mm or the 40 Smith & Wesson. That is what you would expect. And what's ironic about it is that the incapacitation rates for these guns, the overall incapacitation rate for the 9mm, 45, and 40 Smith & Wesson are functionally identical. I mean, they vary from each other by no more than about a percentage point or so. And yet, the lethality vary by considerably more than that. The lethality ratio, I should say, the lethality to incapacitation ratio varies by about 6% on the extreme side. That's a disproportionate difference. Now, is it enough difference to matter? Some people will argue the case. But I do consider it to be an advantage to have a gun that has a relatively high overall incapacitation rate, but relatively low lethality, and that's because the purpose of self-defense isn't to go around killing people. The purpose of self-defense is to stop the threat. And with a 9mm, my chances of stopping the threat without killing someone is much better than it is with the 45. 40 Smith & Wesson would be relatively similar, and the data that we have, as small as it is, not a lot of data, but the 44 Magnum actually winds up being one of the top 3 in terms of a relatively low lethality per incapacitation. But again, the 357 Magnum winds up being one of the top ones at 37.9%. And again, a lot of that I think has to do with the mentality of the people that are using it. It's a revolver, doesn't hold a lot of rounds. People are going to be much more judicious of their use of it. They're going to wait for the target to get closer. They're going to have a tendency to use it more as a get-off-me gun rather than a standoff gun. And that results in more lethality. More people are going to die when you use the gun that way. But if you have a gun that you use at distance to keep someone at distance, you have a better chance of both preserving your own life, how successful you're going to be, 87%, 86%, 87%. You have a much higher chance of preserving your own life, and if you keep the operation at distance and you're willing to use it early in the fight at the greatest distance that you can, you're also going to have a higher chance of saving the other person's life as well. And like I said, in a defensive encounter, the goal is not to kill the other person. The goal is to keep the other person from killing you. That is not the same thing. And one of the reasons why people ask me, that I give when people ask me why I carry a 9mm, and they'll say, there's lots of reasons that I do give, but for me, one of the biggest ones is the moral reason. That is, it is the gun that is the most likely to incapacitate someone without killing them. Okay, I don't look forward to killing anyone. I don't want to kill anyone. I will if I have to. Okay, that is a God-given right to self-defense, and yes, it is talked about in the Bible, and it is talked about in the Bible as being permissible. But even in the Bible, even though it is permitted, it is not preferable. It is not preferable for human life to end. And out of the common cartridges that are out there, the 9mm is the one that does best at fulfilling that godly mandate to preserve human life wherever it is both reasonable, biblically speaking, what God would consider reasonable, and possible. Okay. It is worth looking into, I would say. And this would also be one of my reasons for recommending that people not rely on a .22. The lethality to incapacitation ratio for a .22 is extremely high. If you incapacitate someone with a .22, there's a really good chance that you did it by killing them. Not by keeping them away, not by shooting them in a non-vital area and it just wound up hurting a lot and they decided they didn't want to fight anymore. Because a .22 shot usually doesn't hurt all that much. Not that I'm volunteering to test that out, but all the statistics out there say that .22 shots, if they're not in a vital zone, aren't going to hurt a lot, and because of that, they aren't likely to produce a whole lot of psychological effect. So if you're going to stop someone with a .22, there's a real good chance that you're going to have to kill them to stop them. Now, if you're just talking about general shots at the body, yeah, there's a lot of shots that are going to miss, a lot of shots that are not going to hit in vital areas, that are not going to produce a lot of pain, and so the success rate is relatively low. The lethality rates is very high. The ratio between the two is not good at all. And now, interesting comparison is the lethality rates and the ratios for rifles and shotguns. The lethality rate for rifles is about 60%, shotguns 63%. Meaning that your chances of dying from a single shot to the head or torso by a handgun is about 17.3%, which means you have an over 80% chance of surviving a single handgun shot, which is pretty interesting. Whereas with a long gun, not so great. More than likely than not, you're going to die from a single shot to the head or torso with a long gun. And then as far as the ratio is concerned, handguns, if you've been incapacitated by a handgun shot to the head or torso, there's about a 33% chance that you're going to die, about 1 in 3 cases. If you have been incapacitated by a long gun, though, there's about a 74% chance that you're going to die. Okay, being incapacitated by a long gun usually means that you were killed by a long gun. And this takes me back to why I recommend very frequently that people both get a long gun, but I suggest that people stay away from typical rifles and typical shotguns. And again, it's because of the moral reason. There's other reasons as well, but the moral reason is not insignificant. If you do a rifle with typical rifle cartridges, they're pretty deadly. Shotgun with typical shotgun cartridges, fairly deadly. But if I take a long gun and I put a lighter caliber in it, like a handgun caliber, I get the benefits of the increased accuracy and the decreased lethality, and my difference in being able to deal with the situation is not overly significantly different. Rifles shooting true rifle rounds, shotguns shooting true shotgun rounds are basically, on the whole, just as successful as most of the service caliber handguns are in terms of overall success. But like I said, the handgun rounds a lot less lethal. And so if I'm trying to maximize my own protection while minimizing the chance of ending someone else's life, getting a accurate long gun but in a handgun caliber that's not as likely to kill them is a good compromise between the two, and one that I think that's worth looking at. And like I said, it is an important moral aspect, especially for a Christian. Okay, I am a Reformed Christian. Reformed Christians are biblical in that we do value what is called the Imago Dei, the image of God in humanity, that humans, because they are made in the image of God, have an innate value to them that we ought to seek to preserve within biblical parameters, of course, but we do seek to preserve human life where it is biblically reasonable to do so. And in the case of selecting a caliber to defend yourself with, there are calibers out there that are much less likely to result in the other person's death. 9mm is one of them. 40 Smith & Wesson isn't bad. I don't know how reliable the data set is because it's a small data set, but technically 44 Magnum falls in that category as well. Don't know that I'd want to be standing behind the 44 Magnum, though. It's not a very wieldy gun. There's better options out there. And then a final consideration in terms of what caliber is best is going to be cost. The 25 ACP is kind of an expensive round. The numbers that I got here, these are in dollars per round. The numbers that I got here I pulled from Bud's God Shop, their prices, and one price is without shipping and handling, and the other price is with shipping and handling. So for 25 ACP without shipping and handling, it was 28 cents a round. With shipping and handling, it was 33 cents. And by the way, this is brass case ammo. All of them are brass case just to keep things comparable. 22LR. 22LR does have a lot of disadvantages to it, and that it's not overall very successful, and in the cases where it is successful, it tends to be lethal. That's not great. But one thing that it does got going for it is that its ammo is really cheap. 3 cents before, 3 cents a round before shipping and handling, 4 cents a round after shipping and handling. That's pretty hard to beat. 32 ACP was also one of the more expensive rounds, 27 cents a round before shipping and handling, 32 cents a round after shipping and handling. 380 is not terrible. It's not the least expensive cartridge out there, but it is not awful. I was able to find 380 ACP ammo for 23 cents a round before shipping and handling, 27 cents a round after shipping and handling. 38 Special is again one of the more expensive rounds at 27 cents a round before shipping and handling, 32 cents a round after shipping and handling. A 9mm for a center fire cartridge, it can't compete with the 22LR because 22LR is stupid cheap. 3 or 4 cents a round is like nothing. But for a center fire cartridge, and also for a service grade center fire cartridge, it's one of the service calibers, it's really cheap by comparison. 17 cents a round before shipping and handling, 20 cents a round after shipping and handling. That is phenomenal compared to a lot of the other cartridges that are out there. Not bad. Good job on that one. Part of the reason for that is that 9mm is very common. Like we said, it makes up over a quarter of all the cases that Greg Elefant studied. It's a very common ammo. And when you have something that's very common, the price tends to fall down. 45 ACP is a little bit on the expensive side. It's not as expensive as some, but it is on the expensive side. 27 cents a round before shipping and handling, 32 cents a round after shipping and handling. 40 Smith & Wesson is a bit less than that at 24 cents a round before shipping and handling, 28 cents a round after. So it kind of splits the difference between 9mm and 45 in that regard. 357 Magnum is not an overly cheap round. 35 cents a round before shipping and handling, 41 cents per round after. Now, this is where the fact that 357 Magnum guns can shoot 38 Special guns does tend to be a big thing. Because we go back over to 38 Special, 27 cents a round before shipping and handling looks a whole lot better than 35 cents a round after shipping and handling. So a lot of times people will get 357 Magnums and they'll practice with 38 Special. And that's a way to keep the cost low. There's part of me that really doesn't like that, though, because if you practice with a round that is at a significantly lower pressure than the actual round that you use for defense, you can develop a flinch in the case where you're actually defending yourself, and it makes you much more likely to miss. That was one of the results that came out of the Newhall shooting. And Newhall shooting was a case a long time ago now. Well, long for me. There are obviously a lot of people who were alive at the time. But it was a case quite a ways back. I think it was in the 70s, if I remember correctly. Late 60s or 70s. I think it was in the 70s. And one of the results that came out of it that police departments wound up doing is they said, whatever kind of ammunition we practice with needs to be the kind of ammunition that we're actually carrying in the field, because one of the things that happened is people were shooting more powerful ammo that they had practiced with, and the recoil got them. Under stress, it's very hard to control your impulses, and one of those impulses is your reaction to recoil. If you're cool, calm, collected, you can control your reflex to a great extent, but under stress, a lot of that control goes out the window. And so a lot of the officers that were involved in those incidents wound up pulling their shots quite a bit. And so after that, there was a lot of agencies that, even though they were still issuing .357 revolvers, would never have them loaded with anything beyond 38 Special Plus P. They would not actually put true .357 Magnum ammunition in them, just because they didn't want the officers to pull their shots in a stressful encounter. But if you do decide to go that way, and you decide to practice with .357 so that it's consistent to what you use, which would be good, it's going to be expensive, 35 to 41 cents per round. And then .44 Magnum is definitely not cheap, 53 cents to 63 cents a round, depending on whether you're talking before or after shipping. But that is hugely, hugely expensive. Not very good at all. Not certainly what I would recommend. Now, .44 Magnum guns can technically shoot .44 Special, but the problem there is that .44 Special ammunition is not significantly cheaper than .44 Magnum, so you're not really gaining anything there. And it's always better to practice with the actual kind of ammo that you plan on using. And so if you're going to actually carry a .44 Magnum, you might as well just go ahead and practice with .44 Magnum ammunition and say goodbye to your wrist, because it is going to hurt after a while. All right, so those are all the major considerations for which caliber is best. And if you agree with my assessments of things, that having something that is, a low recoil for the first line, low recoil but still powerful enough to get the job done, over the line of sufficiency, but no more than you have to. If you agree that that's a good idea. If you agree that a bigger diameter bullet is generally going to be better. Now, there's some stuff in the FBI cases that would say that bullets between 0.35 inches and 0.45 inches really don't have a whole lot of difference, measurable difference. I kind of disagree with the FBI on that one. That's technically what they said, but if you agree with me that generally speaking bigger is better, if you agree that looking for ones that have optimal penetration, that it's going to be deep enough to get to the vitals, but not so deep that you wind up wasting a lot of energy coming out the back end, if you agree that that's good. If you agree that it's at least a good idea to look at what other people are using, what's most common out there that seems to be working now is probably a good thing to look at. If you agree with me that looking at terms of overall success is a good metric to go by, did this gun in this caliber success work for me, or did it not? If you agree with me that the overall measure should be whether or not it stopped the threat, not whether or not it killed the other person, but whether or not it stopped the threat, is a valid measure. And whether or not the common guns, common self-defense guns in that caliber have the maximum number of rounds that you'll need for a single adversary is a good thing to be looking at. And if you also agree that you want to have the least lethality versus incapacitation, you have basically the best chance of incapacitating someone without killing them. If you agree with me on all of those things, and also you want to have a caliber that is not overly expensive, then your results are as follows. 25 ACP is the absolute worst. It's like bad in almost every possible way. It's low power, its diameter is small. Not a lot of people use it, they don't seem to really trust it. That's not a good indication in terms of overall effectiveness. Only 65% of the time did it actually work, which is still better than a sharp stick, but still only 65% of the time did it actually work. The high side estimate for the number of rounds you need is basically 11 rounds. I don't know of any 25 ACP guns that hold that. And the lethality rate is pretty high on it. So 25 ACP, not a good option at all. The next worst caliber is 32 ACP in terms of having more things against it than for it. Again, it's low power. The success rate is not overly high. Lots of people don't use it. It's a fairly expensive round. Not terrible, but fairly expensive round. Also, the high sight estimate for the number of rounds that you'll need is considerably more than you're going to find in most 32 ACP guns, etc., etc. There's lots of reasons not to like 32 ACP. Okay, now, this is all in terms of those things. Now, to be fair to the mouse gun calibers, because obviously they're not coming out very good here, to be fair to them, there are some people that those little itty bitty guns are basically the only guns that will work for them. They work in an environment where they have to look fairly professional. They can't really carry anything that's too big on them, and it's better than nothing, and I get that. But if you are someone who can carry something bigger, all the data here is suggesting that you really should carry something bigger. After 25 ACP and 32 ACP, 22 LR comes in. It is generally more successful than the others, and it is definitely, on a per round basis, considerably cheaper than the others. But my personal hang-up with it is the moral issue. The chances that you're going to have to kill someone in order to incapacitate them with 22 LR is very, very, very high. And I would suggest that you think about that very long and hard before adopting 22 LR. With any of the mouse gun calibers, I would say stay away from them, but the 22 LR has a very, very, very high lethality to incapacitation ratio. Think very long and hard about that before you go that way. Okay, there's lots of cases where the 22 LR doesn't work, and if it does work, there's a good chance that you've killed the person in the process. Just pointing that out there. Next, in terms of how bad they are, tied are the 357 Magnum and the 44 Magnum. Somewhat different reasons in each case. In terms of overall effectiveness, neither one is necessarily bad. 91% overall effectiveness, 87% overall effectiveness, that's not bad. They're suitable in that regard, but both of them can be expensive. 357 Magnum, that's somewhat mitigatable because you can put 38 Special in it, but somewhat expensive. In the case of the 357 Magnum, it tends to have a very high lethality rate, and like I said, it's because a lot of people use them as get-off-me guns instead of stay-away-from-me guns, and having a gun with a low round count can do that. 44 Magnum, the biggest disadvantage there, it doesn't hold enough rounds, that's one issue, at least according to the stats here, but the bigger issue I would say is probably going to be the recoil. And that under stress, a heavy recoiling gun is going to cause you to flinch a lot, which means you're going to miss a lot more than you want to. And it's just not going to be a pleasant experience for anyone. Right, and then after that would be the 380 ACP. 380 ACPs, again, tend to be fairly small guns. They don't tend to be very accurate over great ranges. And so people have a tendency to use them as get-off-me guns instead of stay-away-from-me guns. And that can create some problems in overall effectiveness. But overall, not terrible. 84% overall effectiveness. And the lethality versus incapacitation ratio is not good, but it's not terrible either. Conscionably, I could justify using something like that. And then after the 380 ACP is the 38 Special. 38 Special is, again, within what I would consider conscionable in terms of lethality versus incapacitation. Overall effectiveness is not bad, 83%. There's a lot of good things about 38 Special, and but it's just, my biggest issue with it is that it's not as good as some of the other options that are out there. Next up from that, and actually tied in the same position, would be 45 ACP and 40 Smith & Wesson. Both of them are service calibers, considered service calibers, and they are standoff guns. A lot of people who use those are much more comfortable operating at distance. They're going to pull the guns, generally they're going to pull the guns a lot earlier in the confrontation, which gives the other guy an earlier chance to back off, which usually results in increased life expectancy for the other guy. 45 ACP is a bit of an exception to that in that it's a bigger round. And so if it does connect, it's going to create a bigger hole. You have much more likely for bleed through and those kinds of things. And so there is increased lethality there. I would caution about that. But either the 45 or the 40 Smith & Wesson, both of them have very good overall success rates. And the lethality to incapacitation rate for them is not terrible. It's a lot better with the 40 Smith & Wesson, but neither one is absolutely awful. The costs, again, are not super awesome, but they're not as terrible as some, like 357 Magnum or 44 Magnum. But the absolute king of the hill, based on these metrics, what is important to you might vary, but based on these metrics, the absolute king of the hill is the 9mm. It has relatively light recoil, but it's still considerably more than is needed to get the job done. If we use the double-aught buckshot as our standard, 189 foot-pounds of energy will get the job done. 9mm definitely exceeds that. Sometimes it's pretty close to double that. The diameter, even of the 9mm by itself, is sufficient. In fact, in the Greg Elefrit study, about half of the 9mm rounds that were involved, in half of the cases in which 9mm were used, the type of ammunition was regular full metal jacket practice ammo. It wasn't even true defensive ammo. It wasn't expanding ammo. And it still had a very high success rate, even with ammo that didn't expand beyond its nominal diameter. It did just fine at being .355 in most cases. Well, not in most cases, but in half the cases it did just fine. You can get ammunition on the market out there that does have the correct penetration depth between 12 and 18 inches. It's not as easy as with the 38 Special, but there's still plenty of it out on the market, and if you do a little bit of digging, you can find some. And like I said, if you look on Lucky Gunner, they will give you these handy little pictures of how all of them did. And you can go down to the section on 9mm and find, so here we go, the 9mm ones, and you can find the ones that were in the correct range, and you can look for them in your local stores and see if any of them show up. It is definitely possible to get good ammo. And it's also a very well tried and true ammo. It is the round that is preferred by most people. It makes up the largest chunk of the pie as far as the Greg Elefrit study was concerned. It is the one that most people trust. Small enough to be handily concealable, small enough to have a decently light recoil, but still big enough to be a true service caliber and get the job done when it needs to. The success rate is comparable to all the other service calibers. 87% is nothing to sneeze at. The number of rounds that you'll need with 9mm is a little on the high side, but most 9mm hold quite a few rounds. So it's not really that big of a deal. You'll usually have the rounds on you in one magazine. Like I said, my Bersa TPR-9C, it is a fairly small gun, but it holds 13 rounds. It's more than I'm going to need, or at least more than I'm likely to need. There are always exceptions to cases and things like that, but it's not very likely that I'm going to need more than that. And then when I look at the ratio of lethality to incapacitation, 9mm really does stand above the others in that the ability to incapacitate is relatively high versus its lethality. It can incapacitate someone without killing them much better than than any of the other rounds here are. It's a gun that I can use at a standoff distance and maintain distance, and I don't have to worry about getting as close with it as I would other rounds. Not to say that in individual circumstances, you might be jumped, you might have to use it at a close range. But with 9mm, people usually feel a lot more confident about maintaining distance with it and feel better about using it at distance. And that tends to work out better for the other guy. There's a lot better chance that he's going to wind up alive at the end of this. I'm going to be successfully defended. he's probably still going to be alive at the end of it. And then the cost. It's not the best. 22LR is best, but it's not terrible either. In terms of common calibers that are out there for handguns, 9mm is the second cheapest out of these common calibers, at least. That is pretty awesome. And that makes practicing with it much more affordable and practical, and the gun that you practice with is the gun that is going to save your life. If you're well practiced and you've been maintaining your skill, there's a much better chance that you're going to be able to get out of a lethal force confrontation alive and intact. So 9mm, in terms of those metrics, is king of the hill. But as far as overall calibers that I would recommend, 9mm, 45, 40 Smith & Wesson are the top three, and I would consider any of them to be worthwhile. Now, I will say that with 40 Smith & Wesson, you do need to be careful, because a lot of 40 Smith & Wesson guns, especially in the concealed carry markets, are not overly reliable. 40 Smith & Wesson can be an unreliable caliber, and it's not so much because of the caliber, but because of the gun. A lot of 40 Smith & Wesson guns that are out there are basically 9mm that have been converted to 40 Smith & Wesson, and they're usually not really designed for 40 Smith & Wesson from the ground up, and that just tends to create reliability problems. Now, if you stick with one of the higher end companies like, say, Glock or Sig Sauer or something like that, you'll probably be more than decently well off. But if you go with other companies that aren't quite so good, even ones that are fairly good but aren't quite so good, like Ruger or CZ, as much as it pains me to say, because I really like CZ, but CZ 40 caliber guns are usually not overly reliable. If you go with any of the medium tier or low tier manufacturers, 40 Smith & Wesson is probably going to let you down. It's not going to be overly reliable. And so I'm just cautioning on that one. If you want to do 40 Smith & Wesson, really take the time to invest in a real good gun. Top tier gun is what you want, because the other tiers, medium tier, lower tier, they can be unreliable. 45 ACP is definitely a service caliber that can work very well for a lot of people. And because of how a lot of 45s are loaded in the modern, sometimes they shoot better for people. I know that there's certain 45 guns, not all of them, but certain 45 guns that with certain loads shoot very well for me. For example, my father has a 45 Springfield XDE, and I actually shoot that better than I do some of my 9mm, even though I don't really spend that much time on his gun, because it's his gun, not mine. But when I do handle it, a lot of times I can get pretty good accuracy out of it. And a lot of that has to do with the simple fact that the 45 round itself is a longer round, and so the action on the gun will usually take a little bit longer to cycle. It's just a fraction of a second, but it takes a little bit longer to cycle, and that makes it more controllable for me. And so I can actually work pretty well with certain 45 guns. And there are people out there who do shoot 45s more accurately than they do 9mm, and there's also vice versa. And a lot of it depends on the particular gun and the particular ammo that you're putting through it. But for some people, 45 is the right choice because it's the one that they're going to be more accurate with. And then, like I said, my preferred round is the 9mm. As far as I'm concerned, it's kind of the best of all worlds. It's not really the top in any one category. It's not the most powerful. It doesn't have the widest diameter. It does not have optimal penetration in all cases. It does not have the best overall incapacitation rate. But even though it is not the best in any of these categories, it is also not the worst. In fact, a lot of times it's either in the middle or towards the high side. And so when you look at everything as a whole, it winds up actually being pretty good. And the fact that it has the lowest lethality per incapacitation is gravy on top. And if you are a moral person who respects the imago Dei, the image of God in people, and you don't want to kill people unless you have to, 9mm becomes a really, really preferable round at that point. Not to say that other rounds are absolutely awful in that regard, although by comparison, they can definitely be more. 45 is definitely more lethal than 9mm is. That is certainly true. That doesn't mean that 45 is necessarily more successful, though, because there's psychological stops where people are just shot at and they decide that they don't want to fight anymore, or they get hit in the arm and decide that they don't want to fight anymore. Definite cases like that, 45 isn't necessarily more successful. If anything, it's actually a little bit less successful than 9mm. But one of my major concerns with 45, even though I can shoot certain 45 guns more accurately, one of my biggest concerns is that lethality issue. If you shoot someone with a 45, there is a greater chance that you're going to kill them in the process of incapacitating them. That is something that morally is hard for me to get around. And then on the practical side, 45 is kind of an expensive round as well. So for practical reasons and for moral reasons, I don't like 45. I'm coming out and saying that. But even with the fact that I do have a bias against 45, when it comes to the top 3, it's still in the top 3. And when the worst 3 are considered, those are still going to be the mouse gun calibers. Alright, so that is the big gulp look at which caliber is best. Personally, I think that the data says 9mm is best, followed fairly closely by a 45 and 40 Smith & Wesson. And the absolute worst is the 25 ACP, followed closely by the 32 ACP and the 22 LR. The other ones are kind of so-so in the middle. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Bye-bye.